So now, looking at the functions of the liver is super very important. It plays a lot and a lot of the roles. Let's go ahead and see each one of them slowly by slowly. So now, all the nutrients that we absorb from the small intestine and even some other substances that we absorb from the large intestines, all of them are going to be coming to the liver for process of metabolism. Metabolism of proteins, the fats, carbohydrates, and even the vitamins. All of those kind of the metabolic processes are going to be played by what we call the liver. So now the very first function of the liver is going to be what we call metabolism. Okay, what we are calling metabolism of what we call the fats, what you're calling the fats, the proteins, okay, the proteins, and even also what we call the carbohydrates. I'll just spell it like in form of the carbs, okay, the carbohydrates. So now they are all going to get metabolized in what we call the liver, okay. Besides that, the second function, which is super very important of the liver, is what we call bile synthesis. We have seen that the hepatocytes are going to be synthesizing what we call bile into what we call the biliary system. So now the second function of the liver is going to be what we call bile, what we call the bile synthesis. Okay, what we call bile synthesis. And of course, bile is going to be super very important in emulsification of fats, which is going to be happening in what we call the duodenum and other portions of the small intestine. Super very important function of the liver, what we call bile synthesis. Okay. And then another function of the liver is going to be what we call filtering all kind of the substances that doesn't need to access what we call the general circulation. So now the liver also does a role of what we call filtration. Okay, what we call filtration. So now the liver filters a lot of other substances that doesn't need to access what we call the general circulation. Okay, and then another function of the liver is going to be what we call storage. Okay, is what we call a storage role. And mainly, we said that the liver also is going to be converting glucose into what we call glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose. So now in that way, when we eat in food, the levels of glucose are going to be shooting high. That's why the liver converts the glucose into glycogen for storage. So now the liver also plays a role of storage of what we call glycogen, because glucose can be stored in the form of glycogen. Okay. Now, the liver also serves as a role of what we call blood reservoir. Okay, blood reservoir. So now, there is a lot of blood which flows to the liver. Now, the hepatic portal vein, approximately on every single minute that passes, it allows the passage of approximately 1,050 milliliters every single minute that passes, while the hepatic artery proper allows approximately 300 milliliters on every single minute that passes. It means that approximately 1,350 milliliters every minute passes through what we call the liver, and that's going to be what we call 27% of the total cardiac output. Okay, close to 27% of the cardiac output passes through the liver. That's for every minute, meaning that it's going to be a lot of the blood going to what we call the liver. So now what the liver does is going to be expanding to accommodate some of the blood, such that in case there is need, it can allow this kind of the blood to go away. In that way, the liver is functioning as a blood reservoir. Okay. Another function of the liver is going to be what we call detoxification. Okay, what we call detoxification. Okay, so now a lot of the toxins which are going to be coming to the liver are going to be detoxified down, such that the blood leaving the liver going into the general circulation is free from what we call toxins. So now in that way, you're going to be seeing that the liver is doing a role of detoxification. Another function is going to be what we call excretion. Okay, what we call excretion of bile pigments. Okay, excretion of what we call bile pigments. And when we talk of excretion of bile pigments, like for example, the excess cholesterol, what we call even also bilirubin, is going to be excreted through what we call the liver in form of as bile pigments. Okay, and then another function of the liver is going to be what we call heat production. Okay, what we call heat production. So now, because there are very many processes taking place in the liver, metabolic processes taking place into the liver, there's always generation of heat, okay? So now in that way, the liver is going to be helping us in the generation of what we call heat, okay? Another function of the liver is going to be super very important, which we call synthesis of plasma proteins, okay? What we call synthesis of what we call plasma proteins, okay? Plasma proteins. And here the classic example is going to be what we call protein albumin, okay? What we call protein albumin, that's going to be maintaining what we call the oncotic pressure, leave the blood vessels, which might lead into what we call the edema. So now, if the liver is damaged and cannot produce enough of the albumin, the oncotic pressure is going to go down, and then hydrostatic pressure is going to overshoot, making what we call the blood vessels into what we call the extracellular environment, making a certain kind of what we call edema to set in. So now, if someone has a liver problem, cannot make a lot of the albumin, we expect what we call the edema. It is such another beautiful thing, okay? So now another function of the liver is what we call hemolytic function. Hemolytic function. Okay, and when we talk of hemolytic function, we say that these kind of the Kupffer cells can break out worn out red blood cell. In that way, the final product, I don't want to go into the whole process of what's going to be occurring, but the Kupffer cells are going to be breaking down red blood cells into what we call the hemoglobin. Now, the hemoglobin is going now to split more into what we call heme and then the globin. The globin is now a protein which can get recycled for use. And then the heme is going to be acted on by a couple of enzymes into what we call biliverdin. Okay? What the heme oxygenase is going to be acting on what we call the heme into what we call biliverdin, and then also expel what we call the iron. Okay? And then if you also that biliverdin is going to be now reduced, it's going to be acted on by what we call biliverdin reductase into what we call bilirubin. This bilirubin is going to be unconjugated. It's not going to be soluble in water. And that's why this protein albumin is one which is going to be helping in the movement of unconjugated bilirubin from the spleen into the liver for the process of conjugation. So now the liver also does a process of conjugation. It is such another beautiful thing. So now in that way, that hemolytic function of breaking out worn out red blood cells, leading to the formation of what we call unconjugated bilirubin, and then that bilirubin gets conjugated into the liver and then gets excreted as part of bile. Okay. So now another function of the liver is going to be what we call immune role. Okay. So now when we talk of immune role, because we said that the liver has what we call the Kupffer cells that breaks down any kind of the pathogen that has been absorbed with what we call the food. So now in that way, the liver is making sure that all the pathogens are broken down before the blood leaves the liver to go into the general circulation. Is the liver not doing what we call an immune role? So now the liver also plays what we call an immune role by the help of what we call the Kupffer cells. Okay? And then the last one is going to be what we call glucose regulation. Okay, what we call glucose regulation. So now, when we talk of the glucose regulation, now, when you eat a lot of food which is going to be rich in carbohydrates, so now we are going to be having a lot of the glucose being absorbed into what we call the portal system. Now, this kind of the glucose going into the liver is going to be now converted into glycogen, because we don't want this kind of the glucose levels to overshoot. Okay, but that one doesn't happen whenever everything is functioning very well. You know that what we call the pancreatic vein is going to be giving us what we call insulin and other hormones like glucagon. So now whenever you eat, the pancreas, the beta cells of the islet of the Langerhans are going to be giving us what we call insulin, and of course insulin will come with what we call the pancreatic vein to the liver to start the process of what we call glycogenesis. Okay, what we call glycogenesis, converting the excess glucose into what we call glycogen for storage. Okay, so now in that way, if you eat and then you regulate what we call the glucose, not from overshooting, you are doing what we call glucose regulation. Okay, and sometimes whenever the glucose goes low, the pancreas gives us what we call glucagon that comes and enhance other metabolic processes like gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, to make sure that the glucose goes up. So now in that way, the liver is going to be doing a role of what we call glucose regulation. It is such another beautiful thing. So now this briefly covers some of the functions of the liver. They are very, very, very many. But if you are to forget, please do not forget these functions of the liver. Okay? TUMNAD, we have talked a lot of things, and if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support me, and that one can be done by a couple of means. You just like the video, comment down in the comment section, you share this video to someone else whom you think that is so much in need of this kind of information, and please do not forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD all along up to now, and of course, as always, until we meet next time.